All right, chapter 9. The title of chapter 9 is The Confederation and the Constitution. Confederation, that means the Articles of Confederation, the new government that's going to be created by Second Continental Congress. And of course, the Constitution is the Constitution we have today. So let's talk post Revolutionary War, the things that happened in this country. So big time changes after the war. A lot of things changed, but a lot of things stayed the same as well. So we'll talk about that. So the title here is The Revolution of Sentiments. Your sentiments are how the thoughts that you have as an individual. The way we think is that's our sentiments. So here, as a country, we were, I would say, pretty balanced before the war happened. You have your conservatives and you have your liberals and whatnot in this country at the time. But the exodus of 80,000 plus loyalists robbed this country of that conservativeness that we had. That they call it a conservative ballast here. Like the balance was off when 80,000 people leave, and they all are of one makeup. Like in this case, conservative loyalist, then things are going to change, obviously. The upper class elite patriots rose up to power, and they were what I called in the last chapter the second tier aristocracy that somehow found a way for the lower class to fight their battle for them, and it was successful. And now they're going to rise up because the first tier aristocracy, the loyalists, they're gone. There was this new spirit of equality that everybody was talking about throughout the country. Everybody wanted to talk about equality. They wanted to talk about freedom and liberty because that's what second-tier aristocracy used to try to convince the lower class to rise up against Great Britain. Right? Their feelings were that we were overtaxed as a country, our civil liberties were taken away, and we successfully challenged Britain and we won. So the challenge for this to the new government that they were going to create was to come up with some form of government that was acceptable to all 13 states. They required, here's an important word for you, unanimity. Unanimity means unanimous, everyone has to approve. They wanted a government that was strong enough to serve them in their financial needs, but not strong enough to dominate them like they perceived England did. So this, and lastly, this government must never be able to become tyrannical, because again, everybody is considering Britain to have been a tyrannical government. Was it based on a democracy? Yes. Did they have parliament? Yes. They also had kings. They shared power with parliament. Was it as abusive as maybe it was, as it appeared to be, or that second-tier aristocracy was telling everybody? Probably not. But that's how Americans, when they came out of this, were thinking, hey, freedom, freedom, freedom. There was even talk of slaves being freed. That's going to be short-lived, but they talked about it. There was this idea coming out of this that women were going to have a really, really important job in the new republic. The job that they were going to have was to make sure that the kids that they brought up were patriotic, that a mother's love for their children would be the model of what how that children would feel about his country. They called this idea Republican motherhood, that women would be the keepers of the conscience of Americans. Keepers of the conscience. Your conscience is how you think. And mothers were supposed to make sure that they impart in their children patriotism. And their model would be that the mother's love for her children. So again, the founding fathers were throwing around this idea that women had such an important job. Here's a painting by John Singleton Copley. It's his family. He's painted himself in this picture. And this painting is a reflection of Republican motherhood. The light of the painting is directly on the mother. She's doting on her children, and you know, on the background you have John Singleton Copley at the top and his father down below him, and they're looking off into the distance, not paying much attention to the kids. The baby here that the grandpa is holding is, you know, kind of begging for his attention, but he's too busy looking out away from that child. So Republican motherhood reflected in John Singleton's Copley's painting here. Okay, let's talk about state constitutions. Second Continental Congress during the war had the unenviable task of having to fight the war, to coordinate fighting of the war, as well as at the same time come up with a government that was acceptable to all 13 states. We'll call them states now because as of July 4, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was passed, they went from being colonies to being states. However, they had to prove it on the battlefield, right? You can't just say, you know, expect that it's just going to happen just because you say it's going to happen. They were going to have to prove it on the battlefield. And obviously we know that we did prove it on the battlefield. So Second Continental Congress, while they're coming up with this government during the fighting, because they're a temporary body, Second Continental Congress goes down as a really important meeting in our history. But they were meant to be temporary. It was an interim government, and their job was to come up with a permanent government. So they started the planning process. They told the states, hey, you have to come up with a constitution. Every state was required to have a constitution. It must exclude the word England, the word parliament, and the word king in there. And you must have in there how you're going to run your state. Every one of the state constitutions were required to have four things. One, it must begin with a Declaration of Independence, not the Declaration of Independence, capital D, capital I, but a Declaration of Independence. For example, the state of New York declares their independence from England. They said you have to exclude the word England, but in this case, it was okay to put it in there. They must have a list of rights against government, right? The rights that the state has against a strong government. They must have their framework. How are they going to pass laws? Is it going to be bicameral, which means two houses, or is it going to be unicameral, one house? Say, for example, Parliament in England, that's unicameral. In our country, we have a bicameral system, the federal government does, House and Senate, that's today. But now we're talking about each individual state. We also have state Senate, state House of Representatives in the state of California. And then lastly, a weakening in the power of the governor, because in most people's minds at this time, governor meant someone who was sent from the king, and they wanted to get rid of that idea. Yeah. So the economic changes, there were many changes after the war. Economic changes were huge. And here you go. Here are the 5 economic changes after the war. 1, loyalist property was parceled out. First tier aristocracy gone, and now second tier aristocracy has the ability to be able to purchase the land, and they're going to, draw, for the land, and they're going to auction it off. The second thing, no trade with Great Britain, meant the growth of the Industrial Revolution in the United States. Since we got the majority of our factory-made goods from Great Britain, when we were fighting them, we weren't getting those goods, obviously. So with that knowledge, we were required, or we needed to figure out how to create our own clothes. So we started factories, and later on in the book, we'll talk about the coming of the Industrial Revolution. But certainly the severing ties with England helped bring the Industrial Revolution here to the United States. The other thing that you got to know is that the Industrial Revolution was going on for 100 years in Europe before it came to the United States. Third thing, free trade, no more navigation laws or mercantilism. Even though they were loosely enforced because of salutary neglect, we didn't have any. There was no navigation laws anymore. We didn't have to worry about that. So we were free to trade with anyone we wanted. 4, wartime inflation. Anytime wars happen, you have inflation. And then 5, here's a big one right here, is a distaste for any and all taxes, even necessary taxes. Americans were told so much during this revolutionary period that we were being overtaxed, that when we created a new government, we created a government that didn't have the ability to tax, believe it or not, the federal government. So yeah, money doesn't grow on trees, so they're going to struggle mightily because they're not going to be able to charge taxes, because that was the feeling, that was the sentiment coming out of the revolution, was we hate being taxed because we were overtaxed. And I think I made the statement in the last chapter, is that Americans paid 1/20th the amount of taxes than they paid in England. So were they really overtaxed? That was the perception, and that's all that matters. All right, moving on. The next one, let's talk about the actual government that Second Continental Congress came up with. Again, out of that spirit of freedom and independence and hatred for any and all taxes, and we don't want a government that's strong enough to dominate us. Be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. The Articles of Confederation, when it's enacted, is going to be a really, really weak government. But first, let's talk about the train wreck that was the passage of the Articles of Confederation. It took 4 years for the Articles of Confederation to be ratified by the states. And here's why. Because of the bad decision to make it unanimous, that all 13 states had to approve this government before it would become, and I've used this phrase before, the law of the land. Man, that's tough. It's tough for 13 people to agree on any one thing. Now you're going to get 13 states to try to agree upon it. Remember, they required unanimity, and they wanted a government that everybody agreed to. This opened up the possibility of a state with a beef, with an argument, that was unhappy about something, to use this to hold up passage of the new government. And that's exactly what happened. And the state was Maryland. Maryland was upset because they had no Western land claims. Take a look at this map right here. You have your East Coast states now right here, and then you have out west. The United States is in possession of all this territory out here as per the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Now, you could see seated by, this is Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia. You have states that have land claims out there. This idea that these would be future new states wasn't even talked about back then. The prevailing thought is that there were 13 states, and there would always be 13 states, and the states would just extend out west. And that they would even though Massachusetts here, they have a land claim out here, not attached, but that still is part of Massachusetts. And then, if America ever got this territory out west beyond the Mississippi River, that they would just extend. Whereas Virginia might be able to go all the way across to California. So that idea that there would always be 13 states was what most people were thinking. So Maryland, as you see, doesn't have any land claims out west. And they're like, hey, we're going to be this tiny, insignificant state with no land claims, and we're going to get snowed under. We're not going to get any say in what happens in government. So Maryland says basically everybody has to give up their land claims, or someone's got to give us land claims out west. And Maryland said, we're not passing this new government until we get our way. They were able to do that. Therein lies the problem with requiring unanimity. One state could hold up passage, and Maryland did, and it happened for 4 years. The solution finally came when all states out west, East Coast states, all states gave up their Western land claims and handed over all that land to Congress under the new Articles of Confederation and said, here you go, do whatever you want with it. We're tired of this. We need a government. So finally, in 1781, the Articles of Confederation were passed when all those Western states gave up their land claims. So that's how it got done. But it took 4 years to do it. Started coming up with it in 1777 and finally was passed in 1781. So yeah, let's talk about these weak Articles of Confederation, because that's what they were. They're gonna be around for about 7 or 8 years before we overthrow our own government, because it's so weak and so powerless. So let's look at what the Articles of Confederation were. It was really a loose confederation of 13 states. They were loosely tied to each other. Under this system, they had Congress. That's it. One branch of government. One branch of government. Today in our government, we have three. We'll get to that. But one branch only. And the branch was the legislative branch. Of course, they had to make laws. And it was called Congress. Now here's the deal with representation in Congress. Each state had one vote. Each state, no matter how big the state was. So you get a state like Virginia that's humongous, that's 10 times bigger than Rhode Island, and has one vote. Tiny Rhode Island, has also one vote. So Virginia hates it. Rhode Island loves it because they have just as much power as a bigger Virginia. So it presented some problems. All bills dealing with specified subject of importance required at least a 2/3 vote, right? Not majority, right? 2/3 vote. 2/3 for passage. Any amendment, if you were going to change the articles in any way, any part of these articles required, here it is again, here's this word, unanimity. All states had to agree upon it. Congress had no power to regulate commerce, which is trade. There's the anger that Americans had at England because of mercantilism and navigation laws. So they said Congress cannot regulate trade or commerce, or Congress couldn't do that. So again, a lot of what you see in the Articles of Confederation is everything that Americans hated about British rule, or told was the British rule was really bad because they interfered with commerce. Did they really interfere with commerce? A little bit, but mostly it was salutary neglect. Did they really overtax them? In their eyes, they did. They were told they did. In reality, they paid 1/20th the amount of taxes that Britain, if you were from Great Britain, they paid. If you were from England. Here's the big one. Congress could not enforce its tax collection program. They were unable to tax the states. The federal government of the United States could not tax the states. So, the question always comes up is, how did they get their money? All that land that I showed you, they're going to sell it. That's how they're going to stay afloat. That's it. They're not going to be able to tax. Now, that doesn't mean people weren't required to pay taxes, because they were. People did pay taxes, but they paid them to the state. States charge taxes. Federal government could not charge taxes to the states or to individuals. What could Congress do in this weak government? Well, they could deal with other countries. Okay. They could settle disputes between states. They could declare war, and they could coin, or they could borrow money. They could ask people to give them money, like in the form of bonds. So really, when push comes to shove, this is a government that was reduced to begging and pleading for money rather than being able to charge taxes, and didn't have much power at all. So here is this slide right here shows you what Congress, each state had one vote. So here's all your 13 states up here, one state per vote. There is no executive, meaning they had no president, no prime minister, no czar, no dictator, anything. They didn't have anybody in the executive branch, because their feeling was that if you had a prime minister, president, czar, or whatever, they would turn into a dictator. So the fear of that, and there's another one of, you could see the fears that the people had regarding England is they were told that the king was a dictator, and they didn't want anybody turned into a king. They had no judicial system, no courts, because they felt that courts were unfair. So again, it's a government that has one branch only. I told you that the only way they stay afloat, the only way that Congress stays afloat for those 7 years that they're around is through the sale of Western land. People were naturally moving over the Appalachian Mountains, and they wanted to settle in places like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. And the government made a decision with the land ordinance of 1785 to divvy up the land, right? To survey the land into townships that were 6 miles by 6 miles by 6 miles by 6 miles. Here you go. In this, you can see it here. And you had you could purchase 1, 2, 3, 4, as many as you want, as many as you want to pay. You could purchase this land and start farming the land out there. So with the sale of this land, that was big. I came across this. I thought this was kind of interesting. If you were to fly over the United States today, you see all these perfect squares. It says here, if you've ever flown over the United States during the day, you've probably noticed a patchwork of farms that stretch over vast swaths of the country like a grid. It turns out there's a good reason for this visual phenomenon. After the Revolutionary War, the US and Britain signed the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which delineated the new boundaries between what belonged to Britain and what belonged to the new country of the United States. The US went about organizing its new land mostly by creating townships, 6 miles by 6 mile squares. Within these squares was a smaller grid of 36 one square mile squares. These plots of land were sold off mainly to settlers. In older countries like the UK, where the societies had carved up the land over thousands of years, no such deliberate pattern is found. There are other parts of the country where this pattern doesn't appear, including the Gulf Coast around Louisiana, originally settled by France, which had a different style of land allocation. The French were partial to long, skinny tracts of land that all bordered the river, giving everyone access to the river to send their crops off on a boat and making sure that everyone was close enough to socialize. It's incredible to realize how many of these historical decisions continue to influence the culture and industry of our country hundreds of years later. So the next time you're flying across the country, you'll know what you aren't just looking at a bunch of farmlands, you're looking at history. So yeah, the land ordinance of 1785, and that's why those are like that. So there again is the grids. You could kind of see it, the grids that look like that. So interesting stuff. Here's another closer look at it with a map. Here's a big picture view in this map right over here, and you see this square in Ohio. Again, there's a natural gap through the Appalachian Mountains right here between Virginia and Ohio. So a lot of settlers went through that gap. It's called the Cumberland Gap, and they settled in this area. So that's the first area to settle. You could see here, if you were to take this and make it, just focus in on this, you could see here's a square mile, right? 6 square mile by 6 square miles right there. So anyways, here you go. The next law that was passed that was really important in the Articles of Confederation was the Land Ordinance of 1785. Here's where they finally come up with a plan to add states as they go. The first state west of the Appalachian Mountains was Ohio, and it was settled and became a state in 1803. They called this the Northwest. Today, if you were to ask somebody about the Northwest, they'd probably think in their mind Washington, Oregon, Idaho. That's the Pacific Northwest. But the Northwest during this time, right, because that's the Northwest part of what the United States owned, was these areas. So that includes Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And you can see when they all became states. It's the black area in this map right here. The Northwest Ordinance of 1785 is really, really an important law in our history. It's when we finally decided that we were going to, as a country, carve out more states, that we were going to have more than 13 states. And there, as we go west, as soon as the population reaches a certain amount, then they can apply for statehood. And it's a 3-step, 3 stages, 3 steps to statehood. Step number 1, when a territory has enough people, Congress would send a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges to rule that area. What is enough people? Whatever Congress thinks it is. The second step, when the population reaches 5,000 free white males of voting age, a legislature would be chosen by the people, right? You had to be white, you had to be male, and you had to be able to vote for you to be counted toward the population, which was pretty standard during that time. That goes all the way back to the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. They way back in the 1600s. So, yeah, they could then create a legislature for there to be voting on their own, making their own laws. And then when the population reaches 60,000 free white males of voting age, they could apply for statehood. And in 1803, Ohio became a state. Here's another important factor in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Slavery was outlawed in the Northwest Territory. They said no slavery would be allowed out there. That is big. That is important because it is the first anti-slavery law passed in America. Is part of the Northwest Territory. The first anti-slavery law. At this point in 1787, slavery was legal in every state. There were no anti-slavery laws. This is the first one. Another reason why this is such a big, important law that was passed. Overall, as you know, as I've been saying, the Articles of Confederation were a cluster. It was just, there's so many things, so many flaws in this government. Here are some reasons why. One, the United States was not taken seriously by the rest of the world because we had no leader, right? You had no president. There'd be a meeting, international meeting, and they'd send 13 different people, one representing each state. Two, no leadership, goes right along with number one. No president, no king, no prime minister. Also, the Articles, because they didn't charge taxes, they had no money, they could have no military. It did not provide for a military. So you're a country with literally no military. And a lot of things were happening like that we would need a military, like the failure of the British to get out of their forts like they said they would in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Spain at one point closed off the Mississippi River to Americans, so they couldn't use the river anymore. And they were moving out west and using that river. People were moving to Ohio, using the Ohio River, which flows into the Mississippi River, to get their crops to the East Coast. They'd put it on a flatboat, and now Mississippi was closed off. We should have been able to use a military to stop that from happening, but we had no military. We had unpaid bills. We owed France money. We owed individual people money, right? We offered war bonds at this time so that people could, donate money, and we couldn't pay them back. So yeah, financially we were a wreck. And then we had internal problems. A classic example is Daniel Shays led a bunch of Massachusetts farmers who were frustrated from high taxes, because the state of Massachusetts charged their individuals taxes and charged them high taxes. Daniel Shays got a group together and they rioted in Boston, and it's called Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion went on for weeks, and the only way they stopped it was the Massachusetts militia had to stop it. There's no military to stop it. Today, if they were rioting, the military would jump in and stop it from happening, but we had no military. And then lastly, lack of any kind of internal improvements. To build better roads, to build bridges across rivers, you needed money, and they couldn't charge taxes, so they had no money. And there were no internal improvements like bridges and transportation improvements, anything like that. So all in all, Articles had a lot of holes in them. However, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the successes of the Articles of Confederation. There are some, right? For one, it's a stepping stone to the new government, right? It's a stepping stone. It's like, hey, you have these Articles of Confederation. We implemented the Articles of Confederation and realized that it was bad. So it got us to create the Constitution. Two, charting of westward settlement. Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 are lasting laws. Lasting laws. They went into effect, and things like the Northwest Ordinance out of state. Right? Now we're up to 50 states. You have the anti-slavery law from the Northwest Ordinance. You have the fact that the Land Ordinance brought in money for the government to stay afloat. So there's some good in that. Three, they brought the Revolutionary War to an end. They were created in 1781. The war ended in 1783. And then they drew up the Treaty of Paris of 1783 that officially ended the war. So there are some successes of the Articles. However, when push comes to shove, there's a lot of issues. And the first meeting that was called, it was in 1786, George Washington called this meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. And he said, we need to talk about tweaking, changing, altering the Articles of Confederation. Only 5 of 13 states showed up, and they adjourned and said, hey, let's think about this a little bit more. Maybe next year we could have another meeting. And sure enough, a year went by, and in 1787, another convention was implemented, and it was in Philadelphia. And this time you had 12 of the 13 states showed up. The only state that didn't was Rhode Island. You could probably figure out why Rhode Island wouldn't. They're a small state, and they wanted to make sure that they kept the Articles of Confederation. So yeah, they called this meeting in Philadelphia to tweak the Articles of Confederation. Well, when they got to this meeting and they started looking at it, they did something that was unconstitutional. They came to the conclusion that the Articles of Confederation are basically garbage, and they wanted to tear it up and start all over again. And that's what they did. And I say it's unconstitutional because, as you know, in order to change the articles in any way, you needed, there's a word again, unanimity. They needed it to be unanimous. And only 12 of 13 states were there. So, yeah, interesting. The 55 delegates that did attend this convention were rich. They had a lot of money. Average age, 42 years old. And they wanted to make sure that they preserved the money that they had in their pockets. Make no mistake about it. These men were rich, and they wanted to protect their money. But they also wanted to preserve the Union, which could have crumbled. They wanted to protect American democracy from abroad, from other countries. And they wanted to curb mobocracy. Important concept you got to understand is they didn't like the fact that the people had too much power in the Articles of Confederation. They wanted to change that. Interesting to think that that's how our government started, is they wanted to curb mobocracy. And when we get into our government, we'll talk about why that is. George Washington was unanimously elected as chairman. Everybody wanted him to be the guy. He was the one that called the Annapolis meeting. He called this meeting, and they said, hey, you're the guy. He reluctantly took it. James Madison wrote everything. He was the only guy given permission to have a pen and write things down at this convention. It was top secret stuff. They didn't let anyone in the room, only the 55 delegates, and they were sworn to secrecy. This Philadelphia Convention will become known as the Constitutional Convention when they come up with the Constitution that we know of today.